something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club, Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to American Exception. I'm Aaron Good. Today's episode is free for everyone thanks to our American Exception podcast subscribers. If you want access to all of the American Exception podcast episodes so you can better understand the deep politics and history of the U.S. empire, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Seth, Harp, it's great to have you here.
Good to be with you, Aaron.
Seth, your new book has come out, and it is the Fort Bragg Cartel, Drug Trafficking, and Murder in the Special Forces. We talked about these on an earlier episode, some of these things that have happened and surrounding the Fort Bragg murders and so on and so forth in the past. And you took all of these and expanded them, the things that you'd written articles on in the past, into this really powerful book. And can we just start this out? I know this is kind of boilerplate for you, but I think that this is very interesting. And I have focused often more on the intelligence agencies, but I've come to see the military as having an even more profound and kind of sinister role in the political economy of the U.S. empire. So can you explain what Special Forces is and why they have the power that they do today?
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I'll return to the relationship between the military and intelligence agencies because, there's a lot of overlap between those two worlds. But to answer your question, the Special Forces was created a pretty long time ago, before Vietnam, in fact, to be a force that could deploy to foreign countries where the U.S. was either at war or might be at war or had a perceived national security interest or was embroiled in a proxy conflict. And they could do regular warfare, by which was meant recruiting, training proxy forces, arming them and supplying them, and sometimes also leading them in battle. So there's this very sort of kind of like neo-colonialist ethos behind the Special Forces, and they first came to be used in large numbers in Vietnam, where they deployed to the farther reaches of zones of military occupation and trained South Vietnamese forces to fight the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese army. And at that time, they also gained a reputation that would stick with them for many years of savagery and war crimes. And so that's how the Special Forces got started. And although they've evolved a great deal over the years, they still remain, that's still their primary mission for Army Special Forces, what's called Green Berets. And we still see that today in recent history in countries like Afghanistan, where you have a small number of Green Berets, you have like an A team, they call them, and that small team can, in theory, train, equip, and lead a much larger group of let's say Afghan National Army or police soldiers. So in that sense, they are meant to be a force multiplier for the military.
Right, and in the case, in the global war on terror, their role, because the whole posture of the U.S. military changes, and, there goes the peace dividend from ending the Cold War that we never really got. the role of special forces changes, and I mean, I guess I don't say it changes. Let's say it gets amplified to a considerable degree, and they become, in many ways, like death squads. And can you explain the change? What happens? How special forces becomes integrated into the? You call it the GWAT. I call it the GWAT, but it's the same. I kind of like the way that GWAT sounds stupid, but GWAT probably does sound better. But how do they get involved in the war on terror, quote unquote? And how does this change the culture and the profile of the special forces?
Well, certainly there throughout the terror wars, there were accusations and proven cases where special operations soldiers, special forces soldiers, Green Berets, as well as Navy SEALs, because the Navy SEALs are kind of their counterpart, you committed war crimes or extrajudicial killings or other atrocities, sometimes by accident or through negligence, sometimes intentionally. But the units that I talk about in the book as death squads are belong to a higher echelon than just the regular Army Special Forces or Green Berets. They're what's called the Joint Special Operations Command. And in the case of the Army, it's Delta Force. So Delta Force is drawn primarily from the Army, so like the most competitive and high achieving Green Berets and Army Rangers can try out for and be selected for Delta Force, which is a lot more selective, a lot smaller unit than the Green Berets. There's only one Delta Force. It's at Fort Bragg. There's Green Beret groups all over the country. There's thousands of those guys. And there's only a few hundred Delta operators. They are much more focused. They don't do the type of like indigenous proxy force stuff that I was talking about earlier. That's not their role. They do.
They might not have the people skills for that. I mean, I'm sure they probably could do. They probably did do things like that maybe earlier in their careers. Is that about how it goes? But then once they get to this level, they're not there to make friends. Is that sort of the shape of it?
Well, they just have a much more specialized mission set, which tend to be things that are, the most tactically difficult and require the most precision and the most intelligence and planning. So, and that was the case for decades, in which Delta Force was very rarely heard of and not often deployed. But in the story I tell in chapter 5 of my book is how that changed in the surge in Iraq. And not initially, in the first years of the Iraq War, Delta Force was doing things like looking for weapons of mass destruction and hunting regime officials. Still pretty niche stuff, but when the U.S. began to lose that war because of the Iraqi resistance, the insurgency, inflicting a lot of casualties, creating instability in the country, there was a perception and a reality that the U.S. was losing the war. And that is when some ambitious figures in the special operations community stepped up to offer a new path forward, which was the use of Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, which is the naval component of JSOC, again, drawn from the most elite Navy SEALs. This organization, the Joint Special Operations Command, took on a much more central role, which was just assassinations, doing a lot of assassinations. They greatly increased the tempo of assassinations. I mean, exponentially increased in 07 and 08, and started just going out at night and, through the use of intelligence and signals intercepts and tips from paid informants and that kind of thing, figuring out who was associated with the insurgency and then just killing them all. And that was the real turning point in the evolution of this organization and the reason why it got so big and powerful. Whereas before, as I keep emphasizing, it was pretty small and pretty niche. JSOC was. Now JSOC is not niche at all. JSOC is the main sort of center of gravity of U.S. military operations, including right at this very moment, like in Venezuela. JSOC became the leading component of the military by doing not only in Iraq, by doing assassinations not only in Iraq but also this strategy was moved over to Afghanistan because it was perceived to have been a success in Iraq.
And it also in Iraq it involves a lot of bribing of different groups to not attack the U.S. Right? It wasn't merely like these tactical surgical strikes that eliminated the opposition. They had to bribe a lot of people, and the bigger forces are still that were propelling the insurgency are basically the same forces that are trying to kick the military out of there now, like get them out of those bases and such. Do you think that's about right?
Yeah, that's true too. So they called that, the U.S. media is never at a loss for a airbrushed euphemism. They called that the Sunni awakening, which is a very grand name that they applied to the strategy of just paying the tribes in the Anbar to not attack U.S. troops. A lot of those were organized crime tribes, organized crime mafias, essentially. I mean, General Stanley McChrystal, who was the JSOC commander, writes in his book, admits in his book that those were Iraqi mafias, and that the real reason why that they accepted that money and collaborated with the U.S. was because Al Qaeda had suppressed their trafficking, their smuggling and trafficking routes into Syria, and had suppressed organized crime. So the U.S. military and intelligence agencies often make common cause with organized crime groups in countries where they're operating because they're very pliable and easy to buy off. And that's exactly what they do.
I mean, their entire reason for existing is to make money, so they're not that different from the mindset of Americans, really.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And then also Iran. We don't like to admit this, but Iran brokered a truce between the United States and the groups that were fighting it in Iraq, and Iran was responsible, I think, primarily for the decline in violence against American troops in 2008 and 2009. The Iranians did that, by the way, for their own national security reasons. It was in their interest not to have this war raging right next to them. The Iranians don't want a war with the United States. They're terrified of that happening. And that's why they did it. And the U.S., instead of, or I guess I would say the U.S. press, or the government figures, military figures, in their extreme arrogance and lack of, I think just lack of humanity, generosity, what have you, never once talked about the Iranian role in this, and instead put all the credit for the decline in violence in 2008 and 2009 down to the surge and the assassination program. They thought, well, it's because we killed all these people that things, temporarily got better, because of course the lull in violence didn't last very long. But it was enough that it created this moment where people could claim that there had been victory in Iraq. President Bush claimed that he, on his way out of the Oval Office, on his way out of the White House, he claimed that he had scored a major strategic victory in Iraq. And just yesterday, when former General David Petraeus was on stage with al-Jawlani, the Syrian jihadist who's now the president of Syria, he still continues to tout himself as, I commanded the surge. They love to use this type of bombastic language.
It makes it seem like it's these series of epic battles. I mean, it's very strange. So
David Petraeus is still trying to dine out on this one pathetic, limited strategic victory, which proved completely temporary, because of course ISIS emerged years later, right there in the same place. And created even more problems than before for Iraq and for the whole world. But
they were convenient for the U.S. though, because wasn't this around the time that Obama was, basically compelled to remove to take the U.S. out of Iraq, like the status of forces agreements and such had expired and or were being renegotiated, and so whatever it was, the U.S. was going to have to disengage from Iraq, and then suddenly we have this insurgency that is very useful for the it seems to be useful for the neoconservative agenda in the area, and in fact, they later kill the Iranian who's most responsible for defeating ISIS. They just straight up assassinate him. So what do you make about the origins of ISIS? Do you see it as a organic thing in the region, or is it a creation of Western intelligence?
What we know for sure about ISIS is that they resulted from U.S. intervention in Iraq. Whether you can ascribe an intentionality to that is, there's no information that I know that's directly probative of that question. The leaders of ISIS were former Iraqi army not generals, but officers in the Iraqi army, many of whom are, I think all of whom, in fact, have been held in U.S. prison camps, notably Camp Bucca in southern Iraq. So it was an organization that emerged out of the insurgency and gained experience fighting the Americans there in Iraq. And was not its origin was not in the sort of jihadist, anti-American, free-floating, Salafist, although they did adopt all of that as their ideology, because every armed group needs an ideology to motivate fighters and so forth. In reality, the origins of ISIS are in a secular insurgency against the United States in Iraq. And those people, if they ever had covert support from the United States, then it would have been later in 2014, 2015, or perhaps earlier than that. I have around the Arab Spring.
It's what makes it covert, right? I mean, you don't know. And plus the Saudis act as cutouts as well, so they were well equipped. Suspiciously so.
The U.S. often plays this double game, playing the arsonist and the firefighter, and that was certainly going on in Iraq and Syria. They funded the whole time the Iraq War was going on. The State Department and the NGOs that it funds were all working to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. Another, like Saddam Hussein, another outspoken foe of Israel. And they were working to overthrow basically anybody in the Middle East who was a problem for Israel. Syria, Iraq, Libya are the ones that come to mind most immediately, and Iran, of course. And as part of this foreign policy agenda in service of neoconservatism, permanent war, and the Israel first ideology of so many of our most powerful politicians in the United States, they funded the most radical opponents of Bashar al-Assad, Syrian jihadist types, because Assad was secular. His government was not a religious government by any means. And so to destabilize him, the State Department and again, through these NGOs, were supporting clerics, for example, who were radical Wahhabist clerics. And then when the Arab Spring uprising kicked off, and there were protests all across Syria against Assad, many of which were fueled by organic means, dissatisfaction of the people with their government, with the Assad regime. But the U.S. exploited that by arming the Sunni population of the Sunni portion of the population that was inclined to fight against Assad, and plowed an incredible quantity of guns and ammunition into Syria. There was a CIA program that was called Timber Sycamore, and most of those guns are we know for a fact through armaments research and other weapons tracing analyses that have taken place in the war zone, that many of those weapons ended up in the hands of ISIS, cash too, and possibly other forms of support. So that's when you have provable U.S. support for proto-ISIS groups. And then shortly, ISIS quickly became the most powerful player in Syria, and as we know, overran Iraq, and that's when President Obama ordered troops to go back into Iraq. Incidentally, I will say that by 2011 or so, Obama had withdrawn most forces from Iraq. They still remained there. Actually, it was probably JSOC and other elite formations that remained in the Baghdad embassy and in other places in Iraq in small numbers with contractors and so forth. But I in the absence of evidence to the contrary, I tend to believe that the Obama administration did want to get out of Iraq and found themselves pulled back in once their completely misguided and arrogant attempts to overthrow Syria exploded in their faces and then spilled over into Iraq.
Right, and it's interesting to think about that in light of the way that these bureaucracies operate in the military and intelligence, the U.S. military intelligence community, because if they sense a president's particular political leanings, they can create facts on the ground to get the policies they want. So it's between that and the actors in other states, I could see all sorts of potentials to have basically boxed Obama in by people who occupy the command posts of the military and intelligence and a sort of supranational Western deep state, we could call it. So there we were, still stuck there in Iraq. Now, what your book does really well, and I hope you don't mind me, or one of the things it does really well, you lay out the reality of the war on terror in a compelling way, and I know that you were there. And maybe just as an aside here, before I get into this other material related to the figures in your book, I want to ask you how you feel personally when you, having done all this research and seen the way that the U.S. Military and this Imperial project would, as you say, act as the arsonist and then send young American soldiers, mostly men, to put out these fires to advance some political agenda that's never really clearly explained. I mean, how do you reflect on your own service and your own role in these endeavors now that you've gone on to do so much research and you've done so much to expose the reality of it?
Well, when you're young, I joined the Army when I was 19. When you're that age, you tend to not have an expansive view of history. And I didn't. I certainly didn't. I knew that the Iraq War was based on lies. So I had, at that age, I had no reason to question the official narrative around September 11th. Didn't occur to me. I was aware, that there were some shady things in the background of Al Qaeda, that it had grown out of CIA wars in Afghanistan, and that there was some murkiness there. But besides that, I was a complete, I guess you might say, normie would be the internet lingo for someone who accepts mainstream media narratives about foreign war and foreign policy. Even so, I believed that the Bush administration was using 9/11 to justify a war in Iraq that they had already conceived of, and that the case that they were making about weapons of mass destruction was not strong, because there was a lot of contemporaneous reporting. It was steamrolled by, the big players in the media, but I was still out there. It was accessible to even someone like me who was, a teenager who went to a state school and didn't have any access to any kind of rarefied forms of knowledge. I still understood that the Iraq War was BS. But, I had signed up to be in the Army Reserve to pay for college. I did not know that 20 years of war was on the horizon and that it was just going to get worse and worse. The war in Afghanistan at the time, this is completely forgotten, but it seemed that the war in Afghanistan was going to be a small war. Like, it seemed like it was going to be like the war in Grenada or Panama, maybe is a better example. I mean, because Afghanistan does not have it's a big country geographically, but has a small population. And the war was over in a matter of weeks. I mean, the Taliban was deposed in a matter of weeks. So I just was completely unaware of the scale of warfare that was coming down the pike when I signed up to be a truck driver in a road crew, an Army road crew in the Army Reserves, as a way to pay for college without going into student debt. When the Iraq War started, I deployed to Iraq in a reserve unit that built roads and bridges. I was there in Iraq for 15 months, and that was the peak of violence in Iraq. I was outside. It was in 2004 and 2005, and my unit and I, although we were non-combat soldiers, we were outside the wire all the time and came under attack frequently, and lost people, had people killed and wounded, and were involved in gunfights. And I saw firsthand, really the disorganization was the main thing that I was directly confronted with. That my unit was doing these completely inadvisable missions where we're, driving out into places where we're sitting ducks. You can see that the population is furious at us. I knew that my own commanders, chain of command, didn't know what they were doing. The turnover was very alarming. A lot of our officers were replaced for reasons that were never even explained to us. And reading the news, you could see that dysfunction extended all the way to the top. That these people had bit off more than they could chew in Iraq, that they didn't know what they were doing. And of course, at that time, it became clear that the weapons of mass destruction didn't exist and had never existed. So, observing all this and seeing all this, by the time I got home, I was 21. And I used that experience to write, because I wrote for my college newspaper, the Daily Texan. And I used that experience to write, articles that were opposed to the war, and using this perspective to talk about how the Iraq War was a mistake or a crime, and how it should be wound down, and how troops needed to come home. And ever since then, it's been a straight line for me. As a reporter and as a journalist, I've always been consistent in my opposition to these wars. I have never gone the way of your standard issue regime change liberals who say, oh, the Iraq War was a mistake, but now we really need to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Well, I was against the Iraq War, but Muammar Gaddafi, he's a really bad guy. We need to bomb Tripoli. Or in Ukraine, we're the good guys. Actually, it's Russia that's the aggressor. Ever since then, I've been a staunch opponent of U.S. militarism and foreign wars.
Right, and there's nothing. What I appreciate in your book is that you don't pander to the pretensions and the affectation of the what passes for some of the radical left, supposedly, that also will get defensive about the agency of the Ukrainian protesters or Syrian jihadis, or there's this, you seem focused on this imperial capitalist project for global dominance in a sense, and you focus on that. You don't really indulge in any kind of liberal apologetics or bullshit in the book. Did you think of that as something that consciously, or is that just pretty much an accurate reflection of what you thought about? I mean, what's your experience when thinking about how to explain to people what we're actually dealing with here?
It's interesting that you say that. Just a few days ago, I had a conversation with a photographer, a woman who had spent a lot of time in Venezuela. She seemed like a nice enough lady, very liberal in her sensibilities, certainly condemned the Trump administration's attacks on Venezuelan vessels that there's no evidence that they're involved in drug trafficking, what have you. But at the same time, she's just completely obsessed with the sins of the Maduro regime, and talked endlessly about how all the people of Venezuela hate Maduro and want to overthrow him, and are chomping at the bit for freedom and democracy to be brought to them. And she even said at a certain point that she wanted to strangle Nicolas Maduro with her bare hands. And I bring this up because it's just so typical of media elites in the United States that they are obsessed with the sins of foreign dictators and foreign, they're sometimes often like really angry, just visibly angry about foreign boogeymen whom they've been taught to hate and fear by the media. And the whole apparatus of government and media, the foreign policy establishment, for lack of a better word, is always ginning up this type of animus towards one foreign leader or another. And my point of view is not to say Nicolas Maduro is necessarily a good guy or Vladimir Putin is a good ruler of Russia. It's that I don't have anything to say about those governments because I am not a Venezuelan, I'm not a Russian. It is not my business how things are done in Venezuela. I may have some fellow feeling with people in a country that suffers under a bad governance. Let me say Saudi Arabia, because this one kind of just doesn't, it's not part of this paradigm I'm talking about. But they'll just say any and not.
No, they get a pass somehow. It's by and large, it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that element of it, the hypocrisy. When Saudi Arabia, has one of the most autocratic and illiberal regimes in the world, and no one's up in arms about how the Saudi people need to be liberated. But my point is just that isolationism is a dirty word in our discourse, and that's why I specifically am using it more and more, because the way that it antagonizes liberals and neocons, of course. I often focus more directly on liberals because they're like closer to me than the neocons. But everything I say is equally true of the neocons as well. But with them, it's just often more like mask off and aggressive, where they don't even pretend like they care about like the people of Venezuela or the people of Syria. But with the liberals are so antagonized by this term isolationism, which is why I like to use it, because it puts things into clear focus, is that I am not involved in Venezuela's business. I'm not up in Russia's business. It is not, I don't see it as my or any American's role to tell them. It's our role to figure out how our country is governed. And I have strong opinions about how my country is governed. And one of those things is that we're constantly bombing Venezuela or putting them under sanctions or trying to overthrow their government. That's the problem for me. That's what needs to change. I don't care about Nicolas Maduro. I do care about the people of Venezuela, but only in an abstract sense, not only because I don't think my government should do anything to change them or direct them how to live, but also because I don't think it would do any good. I don't think...
Yeah. There's no... What evidence is there for it ever having done any good?
Exactly. And isolationism, by the way, doesn't mean cultural isolationism. It doesn't mean that I don't want to have any discourse with Venezuelan artists and writers and filmmakers and just people and cuisine, what have you, tourism.
Or trade.
Trade as, that's somewhere in the middle. I also think that the benefits of global trade are overstated.
I just mean the sanctions regime and such that's put in, which is, to be not wanting to pursue this kind of imperialism doesn't preclude trade, other kinds of travel, other sorts of relations. It doesn't mean you're isolated like in a box somewhere. It just means that you are not over there attempting to dominate other countries.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I think it's useful to talk about military isolationism. Military isolationism is a wise policy that would benefit our country greatly, to not be militarily involved in all these other countries where we're doing much more harm than good, and everyone knows it, but somehow persists in it anyway. Oh, because like we owe it to the Ukrainians to help them fight for their freedom. This is the liberal mind disease, where you see people like, it's legitimately kind of sad, honestly. That's why I brought up the case of this photographer I was speaking to not long ago. It's sad when you see someone who's so wrought up inside over their hatred, real hatred, that they have for someone like Nicolas Maduro. It's like, who is that to you? Like, why are you so obsessed? Or I mean, it's much more common than it was a few years ago for them to be obsessed with Vladimir Putin. And you know, even members of my family, you know, the whole Thanksgiving dinner cliche, like really uncomfortable conversations when I talk to like an uncle, for example, who's just frothing at the mouth practically about his hatred for Vladimir Putin. It's like, who instilled this in you? And it is the propaganda apparatus that surrounds the war machine that is constantly trying to manufacture the consent needed to wage never-ending wars against these countries.
Right, and they're all illegal as well. I mean, they're unconstitutional essentially, because we've ratified the UN Charter, and so therefore the only military interventions that are legal under the Constitution, because it's a ratified treaty, it's the supreme law of the land. Anything that's not approved by the Security Council, the U.S. military cannot do. But they violate that all over the place. You couldn't even try to come up with a number of how many times they violated it. So it's even just being lawful. If our leaders just acted lawfully and stopped constantly acting as global dictators, and then they just call it the rules-based order. But that just means the U.S. can decide when it wants to invade, bomb, sanction, assassinate anybody.
Well, under the Trump administration, the actions of the intelligence agencies and the military are wholly and openly illegal. No pretense of following U.S. law or international law. But arguably, going back even further, you know, just having a standing army is arguably unconstitutional. And everything that was done after World War II is contrary to the spirit of the original intention, or the original, you know, the way that the U.S. was originally organized in its relationship with foreign states, and the rest of the world. And it's really aberrational that we at the conclusion of World War II, we should have decided, well, instead of demobilizing now that we've defeated fascism, that we're instead gonna make permanent and concrete this army that we've raised, and we're just going to keep waging war forever now, because we just had such a good time and made so much money that we just don't ever want this party to end. You know, speaking from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy elites who are often connected with the banking industry or the petroleum industry.
Yeah, oligarchs of corporate wealth finance all of the both political parties and the think tanks and the lucrative post-military careers of officers, for example. I mean, this is the richest class of oligarchs and most powerful class of oligarchs in human history that are the real owners of this enterprise, we could say.
Absolutely. And, you know, the military guys, they're just the hired guns. Now, if you're a general, then you get honorary membership in the oligarchy and a position on the board of a weapons manufacturing company, so you get to be rich too. Your family gets to be rich, but nobody else in the military gets to partake of all of that wealth that is generated on, you know, that's generated on the back of killing millions of people and destroying foreign countries and spreading misery, suffering, death, and pain all over the world. Based on these lies, like that we're going to liberate Libya and the Libyans are going to be free, or that we're going to liberate Ukraine from the Russian yoke. So it's really, you know, a long time in the making. And what's happening now, what's different now than what's different now than 10 years ago or 30 years ago, is that the machine is really falling apart. I mean, they lost in Vietnam, they lost in Korea, I mean, every single war since World War II they've lost. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. But the dirty secret is that they didn't really lose the wars because there was nothing to win. I mean, they destroyed the opponents of Israel. That was a victory, and made tons of money, and that was a victory. So, that's why I think that the fact that they lost has not been more damaging than it otherwise would have been, because there wasn't an actual U.S. national security interest at stake in Syria, for example. So, you can lose the war in Syria, or, Syria's a little bit different now because now they put this Al-Qaeda guy in charge. But let's say a clear case is a failure like Iraq, or a clear case of failure like in Libya, or in Ukraine, increasingly clear case of failure there. They haven't really redounded to the detriment of the architects of these wars because there is no U.S. national security. And if we had fought a war where something was really at stake, let's say completely crazy,
like some Red Dawn scenario.
Yeah, I mean, we said we fought a war on the Mexican border and somehow lost, and lost a big chunk of Arizona to this hypothetical Mexican aggressor. Totally ridiculous.
Right. Who actually has a pretty legitimate claim to California and Arizona, etc. If you know the history.
Let's put aside.
I'm not saying I advocate them doing that, but you know what I'm saying. It's like but what you're saying, an actual war in America.
Right. If they had lost that, then it would have been a problem for them. People would have said, "Get these bums out of here." But because that hasn't happened, they are able to get away with it for so long. But what's changing is the actual composition of the military is completely hollowed out, and to a degree that people don't realize. Even people who are tracking all these issues that we're talking about, and who might agree with you and I on a lot of these points, don't understand that the military is completely rotted out from the inside. They don't have any people, like they're shrinking. They can't recruit. They did recruit some. They did better recruiting numbers this year, but you're coming off of a decade of either slow or catastrophically slow recruiting, where they just can't fill positions. Thousands and thousands of positions across all the services are empty, including crucial positions. Some of the most highly trained ones are the hardest to fill. A lot of the people who remain are quite old to be in the military because they have retained. They have, using a stopgap measure, they've offered lots and lots of bonuses to people who are senior, who have experience. They're paying them huge amounts of money to stay. Please stay in the military. Please don't leave. Even though they normally in past years would have retired because they're over 40. And in the military, people tend to retire much earlier than a civilian job. And the technology, like the military technology, because the defense industrial base is so corrupt, they have emphasized big ticket items that cost huge amounts of money for so many years with no market discipline over them. The technology is really, really bad. People may be seeing the first signs of that in their own life, where they realize the technology, the apps, the websites, they're all worse than they used to be. Well, in the military, it's like that, but much more extreme, because there's no market discipline or political discipline either. They would constrain defense manufacturers who just get in crazy, astronomically high sums of money to fill these procurement programs and produce garbage technology. So, I just wrote this piece for Harper's about Trump's military parade, and just looking at the military machines that were on display then, like the M1 Abrams tank or the Bradley or the Stryker, talking about how, the U.S. Army hasn't introduced a new armored vehicle in 40 years. It's been 40 years since the Stryker was new. That's the only one in the last 40 years, but that's 20 years old now. So the Stryker was the last one introduced. Before that, it had been in not until the 1980s. Most of the Army's main battle wagons are, most of the armored vehicles are from the 1980s. And they have tried to update them, but their updates are super janky. They're just, imagine like the worst like touchscreen crap you can imagine. trying to sell, the procurement officers on the goofiest like AI type gadgets and gimmicks instead of actually producing more sophisticated vehicles. For example, an army vehicle that could cross a river, for example, is something that a few other large countries actually have been able to introduce. Our country just haven't. There's also more sophisticated tanks that are coming down the pike. It's hard to talk about because China's military is totally untested. Whereas the U.S. military is frequently and often in combat. But the Striker itself was very disappointing. Anyway, that's just one example. The Navy also, we saw recently when they tried to fight the Houthis in Yemen, they went on a head-to-head battle over the control of that strait that controls access to the Red Sea and lost the Houthis. They lost. This U.S. air carrier group deployed to the Red Sea with one mission to reopen that strait to commercial travel was defeated head on by the Houthis, okay? Who Yemen has a per capita GDP that is 1/6 that of Haiti. So it is one of the poorest countries in the world. I believe there are 2 countries in the world that are poorer than Yemen, maybe 3, but all of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. And are some of the most destroyed places in the world. So Yemen is one of the poorest and most destroyed places in the world, but nevertheless, even with their very rudimentary missiles, which they import parts from Iran and then manufacture them locally, they were able to defeat the U.S. Navy, and in fact, they inflicted massive casualties on the equipment of the Navy. Navy only lost 2 guys. They did lose 2 Navy SEALs that died, but mostly it was that they lost maybe 20 plus aircraft. We don't know the number of drones that the Houthis shot down, but it was probably more than a dozen, and conceivably higher than 20. And each one of those cost millions of dollars to manufacture. And the Navy also lost 3 F-18 fighter jets, all 3 of which simply slipped off the deck of these air carriers and sank into the ocean. So it was truly one of the most pathetic performances that any major military in modern times has ever turned in. And by the way, this is the same U.S. Navy that's now steaming down to Venezuela and surrounding them to do stuff, to attack Venezuela. And then finally, I know I've been talking about this for a long time, but again, this is an underappreciated point. I actually don't talk about this in my book, but been looking into it recently. The helicopter crashes are just totally off the charts. The Army has been losing helicopters at a crazy rate, 4 times their average rate since 2023. They've lost dozens of helicopter crew, and this chaos in the Army Aviation Corps culminated when they crashed a helicopter into a regional airliner over the Potomac River this January and killed 68 U.S. civilians, including an entire teenage figure skating team. In January of this year, that was caused by the Army's negligence, by the inexperience of the pilots. As I'm talking about, they aren't able to fill these complex positions, especially helicopter pilots. That's a tough job. That requires years of training. And that's exactly the kind of job they haven't been able to fill. And we're seeing the result of that, which, that's the deadliest airline disaster since 2001. Scores of people who were just flying from Kansas to Washington were killed as a result of it. And then just last week, there was another helicopter crash, which killed the entire crew from what's called the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, which is the most elite helicopter unit in the Army. It's part of JSOC. It's the main aviation element of JSOC. And it's the second time in 2 years that the 160th SOAR, as it's called, has lost an entire crew because they've lost a helicopter. So, yeah, so our military is falling apart, and that's new.
Yes, and I think that when you say hollowed out and you use it to describe the military and the kind of degradation of their technical capabilities, both in terms of the hardware, but also the personnel difficulties that they have. But the hollowing out, that just thinking of the hollowing out of the military, I think it applies to the stories, the lives of the people that you cover as well. And when you, even though these don't translate into things that you could put on a spreadsheet to look at the readiness of the U.S. military, they seem to be more of a fundamental. They have a real fundamental dimension. It just gets to the core of what's wrong with the people when you think of the psychic damage that these people around this insane culture, end up it destroys them. I mean, we could, if we had more time, I could talk more about the individual stories of these figures because they're all compelling, and I don't think even describing them actually spoils the book because it's more of your investigation into the deeper aspects of their lives and your ways of trying to explain what happened to them. It's a strong point of the book, but collectively these people like Mark Leschyker and Bill Levine, you open the story with Levine killing Leschyker, and these guys were the best of friends, and the more that you look at both of them, they both seem to, saying they have PTSD doesn't even really begin to cover what's the matter with these guys. They're just damaged by a dependence on drugs, exposure to violence, and just a culture of criminality in U.S. foreign policy that they just seem to translate into their own lives. So how do you feel that the hollowing out, the sort of psychic hollowing out of a military force that you depict with all of these characters, how does this relate to how do you make the connection between the hollowing out of the military and then the sort of just hollowing out of any kind of psychic resilience or morality among these people? I mean, they just are destroyed. I actually felt sorry. Even the worst of the people you describe, I see as being people that were turned into these kind of monstrous figures.
Yeah, those concepts are absolutely related. And guys like Billy Levine and Timothy and Mark Leschyker, yeah, as you say, PTSD is only one small part of what's going on with them. They are living embodiments of the way that the Army and the whole military has been hollowed out by 20 years of war. Importantly, 20 years of war that does not have legitimacy in mainstream culture. Like, it's still very respectable in like elite media and government circles, but among normal people, elsewhere in the country, the wars are regarded as giant frauds. And so to have served in those wars time and again, a dozen deployments or more, because that's what the GWAT evolved to be, was a war that was waged entirely by special forces, because once the political capital to sustain large-scale foreign occupations had evaporated as a result of the disaster in Iraq, the way that they kept the wars going was to redeploy those conventional troops or to put them on hardened bases where they wouldn't get killed, and then have all of the killing and violence be carried out by special forces, who are, because they're better trained, and more experienced, they suffer casualties at a much lower rate. So you don't have nearly as many U.S. casualties. That's the main thing that Americans notice and care about, and the main driver of dissatisfaction with wars like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not foreigners who get killed, but American troops. So if you can control American troop deaths, you can kill as many foreigners as you like. It's basically the calculus that the U.S. government has, by trial and error, settled upon. And that, the paradigm under President Obama was drone strikes and night raids. Night raids just being a euphemism for special forces assassinations. And to do that, to sustain that for decades, you've got to have guys like Billy Levine and Mark Leschyker doing, in Leschyker's case, 3 tours of combat, but he was a relatively middling Green Beret. Levine, who was a member of Delta Force, had done 14 deployments. And those are the kind of guys who are really carrying the war effort on their shoulders. And it showed in every aspect of his life. I mean, both of those guys were deeply addicted to drugs. Both had severe anger issues and paranoia, and completely tumultuous family lives, divorce, infidelity, those kind of things in Levine's case. I used that scene from Disney World in the first chapters of the book to not only illustrate just how fucked up that both of them were, but when Levine just lost his temper because they were arguing, just lost his temper and then shot and killed his buddy because he couldn't restrain his anger. It just exploded out of him, and he acted on his training. He had killed so many people already by then that he just did it automatically. But what I really wanted to show was how the district attorney and the military authorities covered that up so swiftly and made it look like it was a justifiable homicide when that was contradicted by the physical evidence, conclusively contradicted by the physical evidence. They still pretended to believe Levine's fake story of self-defense, which was the third account of the shooting he had given. First two accounts were wildly different. But they still pretended to believe him and still gave him a pass for committing a first-degree murder on U.S. soil in front of two little kids because he's a member of Delta Force, and that unit has become so untouchable. And, this returns to what you were saying at the beginning of this conversation about the intelligence agencies versus the military. I mean, JSOC has definitely eclipsed the CIA in terms of its operational significance. Operators like Levine are as untouchable as CIA paramilitaries, and in a lot of cases, the people who end up working for the CIA are groomed and come up through the military side of things. The CIA itself has become militarized, and in the past, you would have like skull and bonesmen, who spent their youth reading, Oscar Wilde, and drinking sherry out of Geronimo's skull or whatever at Yale.
Yeah, those are like weird oligarch, kids, basically, like grown up Ivy League, super sons of privilege.
The CIA is really not like that anymore, I don't think. My sense of it is that it's quite different.
It's more bland and corporate, I think, in its personnel.
For sure, and also a lot more ex-military.
Yeah, right. And what it even means to be more corporate or more militarized at this point is like you'd be really splitting hairs. But yeah, it's definitely a different, not patrician, no. It's quite different. It's this scary 21st century corporate imperialism.
Yeah, definitely. And so, but I think it's the wrong question to ask which one is more powerful, influential. They work together. They work hand in glove. I mean, the CIA and Delta work hand in glove everywhere. It's just that JSOC's role is what has unambiguously grown. That's new. It wasn't like that in the past. And it's hard to say. It's a moving target, and also it's an organization that evolves right in front of your eyes. But what they're doing now, they're active in Venezuela. The Times recently reported on some of the buildup around Venezuela, and it's clear that those are JSOC-led task forces. They bring people from all different organizations, but the people at the top are JSOC officers, and they're doing JSOC type of operations, which is covert operations, covert military operations, where the essence of it is that it's secret, and they'll reveal stuff if they feel like it, if they choose to. But for the most part, it's totally opaque around what they're doing. And this is the new paradigm under Trump, which is that they'll just do stuff without seeking any authorization for it, without trying to justify it, using these military organizations that grew up and matured during the global war on terrorism, or the terror wars, and they became what they are today. So it's hard to predict, where exactly it goes next, but you can be sure that they'll remain at the forefront of whatever's going on in terms of foreign policy, and will remain a force for increased war, increased violence and killing, and decreased accountability.
Yeah, that seems to be the general direction. I think that the last subject that I would like to ask you about in your book, and you can elaborate on it as much as you'd like, pertains to the drugs. And this drug angle in Afghanistan, which after the U.S. takes over, similar to in Southeast Asia, where the explosion of opium production coincides with U.S. intervention and then declines when the U.S. leaves. You had a similar dynamic in Afghanistan. And I've done a whole lot of research on this in my dissertation and elsewhere. And Peter Dale Scott also, as somebody that you cite in your book and that anybody who really writes about these subjects cites. And further research into these areas to me is mind-blowing, because in his book on JFK, he writes about the crime syndicate and other people like Sally Denton and her husband, I think Morris, maybe. He was a former national security guy. And they wrote this book all about Vegas and Lansky and all this. But the takeaway is, with Operation Underworld in World War II, the U.S. partnered with Meyer Lansky and Luciano. Around the same time, 1945, a couple of years later, you have the Medal of Honor, or Medal of Freedom, given by Harry Truman to Meyer Lansky in a secret ceremony. It got auctioned off recently, the actual medal did. And he's the person in charge of the National Crime Syndicate. And in 1945 and 46, they established a heroin syndicate in Mexico by this guy named Harold Meltzer. And in order to deal with all that money, they create Las Vegas. And this is really the origin of Las Vegas. With all these Lansky casinos and their enormous money laundering enterprises. And I think, and Peter, I've had many discussions with him about this, believe that the gambling is a real thing, but the drug money is just enormous, and it gets laundered and so on. And they get used for assassination apparatuses as well, the assets of this underworld global crime syndicate. Now, you fast forward to today, and Max Blumenthal wrote an article about Sheldon Adelson and his Sands Casino, and when they wanted to surveil and then assassinate Assange, they actually outsourced this to Sands Casino, the security there, which is owned by Adelson, one of the biggest founders of Birthright Tours and Trump's biggest founder, super ultra-Zionist guy. So it's like, and Sands was originally a Lansky joint. I mean, it was literally a Lansky casino in Vegas. So it's like there's the other element of this, which you get into in terms of the economics of it, but I think you've just scratched the surface of it, is the drug trade and the enormous amount of money in that. How much do you see this as a factor driving Afghanistan, and then the exploits, misadventures, and horrors of these soldiers who get involved in the drug traffic? I mean, how much of this is them going off the reservation versus just they're trying to get a piece of the action that the empire basically controls?
Well, I wasn't familiar with all of that history, of the heroin trade and the link between organized crime and in Las Vegas and Vietnam. But it makes sense because if you had a big pile of cash to launder, you could just take it to a casino and then lose it. Quote unquote, lose it to the house. And then Khashoggi, during the period that the casinos were managed by Howard Hughes, he would go there and lose $200,000, a day, like just signing these checks over to the Sands Casino. That was actually the casino. I'm sorry, I found this out the other day, or came across it again, and it blew my mind. Yeah, there you go. So that makes sense. My big question about Afghanistan is where all the money from the drugs went, because I really don't have any insight in that. What I can say for sure is that U.S. intervention turned Afghanistan into a narco state, and for 20 years, virtually all of the world's heroin and morphine and opium were produced by warlords that were directly on the payroll of the CIA, and that were guarded in their persons and in their property by U.S. service members. And that was done more or less openly. The only thing keeping it from the American public was the willingness of, the reporters and editors of the newspapers of record and wire services to turn a blind eye, which they did for 20 years, for the most part, with some minor exceptions, and some significant exceptions. And Harper's Magazine, I always try to give them credit. Twice during the war in Afghanistan, published significant articles that cast light on what the U.S. was doing with respect to the Afghan heroin trade, and that was Alexander Coburn who wrote one of them, and Matthew.
I think it was a different Coburn. I think you could be right, but there's like 3 of them, and one Alex has been dead for a while, I think, and then there's Patrick.
Did I say Alex? I meant to say Andrew.
Patrick and Andrew. Yeah, Andrew is the.
I'm sorry, I meant to say Andrew Coburn. Thank you for catching that.
Their relative was the rear admiral who burned down the White House back in the War of 1812. That's just a weird fact about the Cockburn family, however you say it. It's my high school students thought his name was very funny, and then that he burned down the White House is just bananas.
The Coburns are very proud of that, as well they should be. It's kind of bragging rights when one of your ancestors has torched the White House to the ground.
There's a portrait of him with like his official portrait. It has burning. It's like a selfie before selfies.
Amazing. Well,
yeah, they did write it. And Harper. That's cool that Harper's is publishing you. They've traditionally been the best of the sort of quasi mainstream or whatever the mainstream outlets. Like they have a good tradition of that. Jim Hogan used to write there back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they've also never published the articles, that propagate the misinformation and deceptions that are used to manufacture consent around these military operations. But that aside, so Afghanistan, for all these years and years, was producing all the heroin in the world at the same time that the U.S. was suffering a massive heroin overdose crisis because there was so much of it on the streets, and it was such high purity and low prices because of the abundance of supply. And that was true everywhere in the world, from Australia to Russia, to Eastern and Western Europe, and Pakistan, Iran. It was true all over the world. Everywhere that was either close to Afghanistan geographically, or that was an affluent country such that there was a market for recreational drugs, they all experienced surges in heroin availability, thanks to the Afghan cartel that the U.S. government created in the first place, armed, funded, and protected both politically and militarily for 20 years, while in the full knowledge that they were flooding the world with heroin. And what I would like to know is that, where that money went. I mean, there's limited information about it. It went to Hamid Karzai's family. A lot of it did, because at one point, because the official story was that the Taliban was doing all this. The exact opposite of the truth. There was never any evidence the Taliban was involved at all. But it's kind of weird because sometimes, propaganda gets taken back up into the machine itself. The propaganda gets spit out by the machine, gets taken back up, and so you end up with people working inside these systems who actually believe the propaganda. So they were convinced that that the Taliban was funding its operations through drug trafficking. So they set up a cell that was tasked with interrupting their supposed drug money flows. Well, it turns out that all the drug monies that they traced were going back to people that were close to Hamid Karzai through Dubai. So they shut it down, but not before the director of that finance cell made public statements where he told people that, hey, the Taliban is not involved in drug trafficking. It's actually Hamid Karzai's family. So it was always leaky, but things don't get through to a mainstream audience unless they're really, really emphasized again and again and repeated in clear terms by the mainstream media. So although there was the information that's out there all along, it really never cohered into a story that Americans were aware of. But that's the limited information about the money. Because that's a lot of money, talking about supplying all the world's heroin for 20 years. Mexico supplied a little bit. Mexico's being the only other major producer of heroin in the world. But we're talking about 5% that Mexico's. So 95% that is Afghanistan's producing. And where did all that money go? Who got so fantastically rich? Because we know somebody did, or lots of people did. And the opacity around that is kind of chilling, to be honest. You were talking about Meyer Lansky and the Sands Casino I've never heard a word about where all the Afghan drug money went.
Right, but it must have gone back into the Western financial system and into the coffers of different oligarchs who are positioned sort of like Meyer Lansky was. I mean, I think it's a major industry, and it's a major part of the economy of the Western imperialism, and it has been since the end of World War II. I mean, it really goes back further with the Opium Wars in Britain and so on, but it's so radioactive to address it. But it has to have, I think it's so lucrative in terms of the profit margin, it may well have changed the constituency, the composition of the oligarchs of the U.S., of U.S. wealth. And the scary thing about that is it's an enterprise that can only operate with political corruption. So as a matter of course, these people become the most politically connected because they have to be in order to get this arrangement, to be able to commit the crimes without ever being held to account for it.
Well, it's fair to suspect that. I certainly see why you would think that that's probably the case. But I just haven't seen any information at all about that and who those people might be, who those oligarchs might be. And, the absence of information is, in a way, even more chilling than, if it were actually better known or if there were some clues. Because, there's certain countries that I think are certainly involved. Tajikistan, Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, all the Gulf states, Pakistan and Turkey. There are substantial, supply chains that drew on Afghan heroin based in those countries. We know that, or I've seen reporting around that to substantiate that, but who these people are is a mystery. Except, again, I keep saying Hamid Karzai. I mean, that would be where an investigation should start. His family runs a chain of restaurants in the United States. And it wasn't just him, it was his brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, who was, before he was killed, was the biggest drug lord in all of Afghanistan. These are people that are feted by the ruling class. Even now, it's like a cool thing. Afghan restaurants are all the rage in Washington, D.C. Everyone loves to eat Afghan food because they're indulging in this, this warmed over fantasy of imperialist glamour that's inherited from our British forefathers. They want to be dressed in khaki and in tropical or desert locales, running things and fighting counterinsurgencies. It's in our culture. Imperialism is in our culture of this country. It's in the culture of the elite class, the ruling class, not in anybody else. The rest of Americans, by and large, unless acted on by an external force, are generally of the opinion that we should stay out of foreign wars because that's freaking common sense. It's not, everybody knows intuitively that it's not good for us, that we don't want that war is bad, People just understand intuitively because of their innate decency and common sense that war is bad and war is to be avoided. And you need these external forces of the corporate media and the state to act upon them, to convince them that no, in fact, we need another new war this year, just like we got last year, and just like the year before, going all the way back to 1947.
Yes, and I feel that this project, this Imperial project, which is coming to a close because it's so, as you point out with the problems with the military, they're inefficient, corrupt, and so not really the best way to organize human endeavors is through this predatory, corrupt model. And for many, many decades, we succeeded in basically crushing any society that would try to organize in a more efficient and pro-human way. And yet now I think that the global majority is actually changing and has changed the balance of power, and that we are living now, we are like Wile E. Coyote who's run out over the cliff, and the fall is coming, and it's no longer the best. You can't make an honest argument for this system anymore and its leadership, etc. And I think that the fact that your book was picked up by a major publisher and that it's been You got a deal with HBO for a documentary, I assume. To me, that's really encouraging, because at some point when this fails, and as it is failing, people want to understand how can it be this absurd and twisted and corrupt. How did we get to this point? And your work, I think, is really valuable in this. So could you tell people where to buy the book, and maybe any details about the film that's coming out?
Sure. The book, you can get it anywhere that you buy books. It was sold out. It has been sold out sporadically since it was published. But Barnes and Noble's website has generally been delivering it 1 to 2 days, sent without any interruptions. Books A Million also has had really strong inventory. Amazon has been backed up at times, but if you check it, it'll tell you how what expected wait time, and depending on your area, maybe just a day or two. You can also get the ebook from Audible wherever you listen to, or excuse me, the audiobook wherever
It's good. I listened to it.
Okay, good. And you can also call your local bookstore. It's an independent bookstore. It was on the indie bestseller list as well as the New York Times bestseller list. So I think now that Viking has ordered more printing, additional printings of it, it should be pretty easy for folks to find. Again, if their local bookstore doesn't have it, then try Books A Million or Barnes and Noble, and then Amazon is always there as a fallback. And as far as the HBO show goes, yeah, I'm really excited about that. HBO has optioned the rights to the book for a TV series, actually a scripted TV series. And there were a number of other film and TV studios that did, but we went with HBO because they have a track record of producing morally serious, ambitious, and dark, television series. And I really wanted to maintain the artistic integrity of the work because, consistent with the conversation we're having, I'm writing not to please the sort of editorial board of the newspapers of record or the other tastemakers and gatekeepers who award prizes and stuff, but I'm trying to write for the future, praying that there is a future that's beyond this era of U.S. imperialism and war, in which people I think will look back and ask what happened. I'm trying to address those audiences, and the HBO show, we intend for it. My partner on that, because they, one of our conditions was I be allowed to be an executive producer of the show, so that I can make sure it doesn't get bastardized and turned into the opposite of what it really was meant to be. And my partner on that is Lynn Amato, and he and I, intend for this show to be really the definitive representation of the terror wars that will stand the test of time in a way that other movies about these wars have not or will not. I'm thinking about the Zero Dark 30, for example, or other big budget Hollywood films that have really not presented the truth and function more as propagandistic exercises in legitimizing state violence. And we think the truth is a lot more interesting and a lot more entertaining. And that's what we intend to represent, in the show. Although it will be a fiction, it's not a documentary. It'll be a fictionalized version. But yeah, that's our intention behind it, and hopefully folks will stay tuned for developments in that space as well.
Right. I mean, I do actually pay for HBO, but I would get a subscription just for that when it comes out, assuming that it turns out well, and not like one of those weird like the Chaos Project with Earl Morris, how he kind of bastardized that. It sounds like you're not going to let that happen. So yeah, the book I give my highest recommendation to. I really admire you for writing it. You humanize these people and make me think about these subjects in different ways, which is hard to do in and of itself, given what I've done for the last 15 years. So I encourage everybody to get the book. And I want to thank you for being so generous with your time today, and for writing this book in general and doing what you do, because the incentives are not there for people to do this. You have to be a little bit unreasonable to decide to really go at it this way. So deep respect to you for that.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate your support. it means a lot to me. Thanks for having me on your show. It's always great to talk to you.
Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
For access to the rest of our vast and growing library, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I also want to express my deep appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers on Patreon. Please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. American Exception exists thanks to our Patreon subscribers. On YouTube, we will never be viable. You may notice that we have dropped the Devil's Chess Club title from these episodes. After David Talbot had to leave our team due to his second, more debilitating stroke, I kept the Devil's Chess Club name and theme song and intro. I didn't want to close the book on David's partnership with Bryce and me. I had hopes that he would return. David and I had planned to write 2 books together after 2024, one on the ultra-Zionist neocon takeover of U.S. foreign policy, and another on the RFK assassination. It now seems very unlikely that David will return to podcasting or to writing. As such, it didn't make sense to keep using the Devil's Chess Club brand. Still, to pay homage to David and the outstanding books that David wrote with his wonderful research assistant, Karen Croft, we're going to keep using the Devil's Chess Club theme song intro for our video episodes. David, if you're listening, know that we miss you very much. Finally, and again, please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Subscribe so that American Exception can continue to mind the darkness.